Okay.
So, yeah, after
Okay.
that's fine. Am I on? Hello. Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to our next session here at the Logistics Hub. We're going to have a really interesting discussion here and a short presentation, first of all, where we're going to be looking at taking a fair approach to net zero for air freighted produce. I'm going to be joined today by three very special guests for a panel discussion. But before we get into that and before I introduce all of them to you, we're going to have a short presentation from Simon Derrick, the Global Head of Sustainability at Blue Skies. Simon, over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. It's nice to see you all. Oh, something's going on. I hope everyone is well. So, my name is, I don't know if somebody's trying to send me a message, but my name is Simon Derrick. I'm Head of Sustainability at, Testing, does that work? Am I back on? I'm back. My name's Simon. I'm Head of Sustainability at Blue Skies. I want to thank FruitNet and Fruit Logistica for inviting us here to speak today. And to thank you all for coming along to this session. We're here to talk about flying for good and how to make the case for air freight in the context of net zero. Because I think we all now acknowledge that global warming is not just a prediction, it is actually happening. All around us we see evidence of this, whether it be extreme weather, setting new records. Even today we saw in the headlines about reaching that 1.5 degree ceiling already in 2023. And we see rising temperatures that are exceeding the worst case scenarios. And I think we also know that we can't just sit back and let someone else solve the problem for us. We all have a responsibility to act, and we must all do so now. Simply put, we must all strive to reduce our emissions as far as possible and as quickly as possible in order to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, which will inevitably affect every single one of us in this room and our future generations. And because of this, we see, rightly so, a big drive to achieve net zero. Many businesses, including many businesses here at Fruit Logistica, including retailers, growers, manufacturers, distribution companies, logistics companies, have set net zero goals, science-based net zero targets, and are developing plans to achieve this. But as we seek to accelerate our journeys to net zero, we need to be aware and cautious of the unintended consequences. Trying to do the right thing is actually rarely ever easy. It can be very difficult. And we can often see examples of unintended consequences in some of the eco-choices that we might decide to make, having negative impacts elsewhere. For example, the drive to reduce plastics can increase demand for paper, therefore heightening the risks of deforestation. Or the move to biodegradable or compostable materials can contaminate recycling streams. And we see how, we saw even in the press quite recently, how even LNG gas is under the microscope as potentially causing methane emissions. And then, of course, there's air freight. We often hear that flying food can create around 50 times more carbon emissions than shipping. This is a quote that's often used, and we see it often. And these are big numbers. And I think we have to stop and think. Actually, how representative is this of the reality? What figures are these based on? What assumptions are these based on? Because I think quite often there's more to it than what we are told. And if we add a bit more context, I think we can see that transport of food is only 1.56% of total global emissions, and of this, just 0.16% is from air freight. And then if we look at where a lot of air-freighted fresh produce is coming from, Africa, we can see that the whole continent contributes only 3% of global emissions. And then if we look at the social and economic impact of air freight, we can see from research that was recently conducted by the University of Exeter that air freight supports at least 5 million livelihoods in Africa. Now, this is a conservative figure based on initial research. We think it's far more than this. And this enables inward investment, inclusive economic development, and providing a vital way out of poverty for vulnerable communities. And so if we take all this into account, does the statement that flying food is 50 times worse than shipping really tell the full story? And is it therefore morally right for us to be aiming to stop air freighting fresh produce? And that really is the risk that we are up against, because we are seeing a call to ban, to reduce air-freighted food, air-freighted fresh produce. And if we ask that question, is it morally right to stop air-freighting fresh produce, we can look back to past campaigns and see that, that they're suggesting it's not. In 2008, we saw the air freight sector under threat when the Soil Association proposed banning air-freighted organics. And in response, we saw academics, NGOs, and the UK government coming out to support air freight, highlighting the positive impacts of supporting trade from developing countries. It was also the first time we saw the notion of fair miles introduced. And it was introduced in a report by Oxfam and IIED. And one of the authors of that report is with us today, James MacGregor, and he's going to be joining us on the Q&A after this short presentation. So fast forward 16 years later, and Fair Miles is back. And not to stop our progress towards net zero, let's make that clear, but to ensure that we go about it in a way that is fair, inclusive, and equitable. Not just looking at our own interests here in the West, but looking after everybody's interests. Ensuring we meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs as well. Fundamentally, it's about climate justice and ensuring that we are protecting and not penalizing the most vulnerable communities in how we respond to and adapt to climate change. And so today, Fair Miles is a growing consortium of organizations, including fresh produce companies, development organizations, and universities, looking to answer the question, how do we take a fair approach to net zero without stopping vital market access for developing world producers? Our aim is to conduct further research on this topic, to raise awareness of the impacts that are often not talked about in the public domain, to have a more balanced conversation, and to advocate net zero guidance that can help businesses take into account the full direct and indirect sustainability implications for vulnerable communities, so that we can make a responsible decision in our efforts to decarbonize. So hopefully that gives you sorry, I'm all over the place with slides, but hopefully that gives you a bit of background into what Fair Miles is about ahead of our panel discussion and Q&A just now. So I'd also just want to let you know that we're going to be at the co-leads booth at the back of this hall, at C90 from 11 o'clock to 12 o'clock. So if anyone fancies a chat afterwards, please come and see us there. And that really just leaves me to say thank you very much, and we'll hand back to you, Michael.
Thank you so much for that, Simon. Please do have a seat, and I'd like to welcome two further guests now to join us for our discussion. Morag Webb is Head of Science and Policy at CoLead, which is the committee linking entrepreneurship, agriculture and development. And sustainability expert James MacGregor from G37 Consulting in the UK, who Simon referred to in his presentation. Thank you both so much for joining us. And before we get into the meat of our discussion, can I ask you, James and Morag, please, to just tell us a little bit about the organizations that you represent and how you came to be involved and why you want to be involved in this Air Miles project. James, perhaps you could go first.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. James MacGregor. I authored the report back in 2006 about fair miles. The reason I'm here today is to bring the experience of how we were able to communicate the win-wins from air freight of fresh produce from around the world into the UK and into Europe. Those wins are lower carbon emissions, much higher sustainable development around the world, so you're talking about SDGs, not just about carbon, and also the collaboration and cooperation of the entire supply chain, where you have win-wins along that supply chain, from the point of view of better produce, efficiency, and ultimately profitability for everybody, shared profitability.
Thank you very much. And Morag, tell us a bit about Co-Lead and what your involvement is.
Hi, morning everybody. I'm here representing Co-Lead. We're an association, and our membership includes fruit and vegetable producers from Africa, Caribbean, Pacific countries who are accessing markets locally, regionally, and internationally, and other stakeholders also involved in that trade, as well as some European importers. So we've been active now for over 50 years as an association representing our members, but also for the last 25 years or so, we've become more and more engaged in implementing development programs, and those are financed by a variety of donors, but the most important of those is the European Union. So we've been working together with exporters, producers from Africa predominantly, and going on the journey with them of continuing to access these very demanding global markets, particularly European markets. And any of you who've been involved in the trade will know the hoops that everybody has had to jump through during that time. We've had more stringent food safety requirements. We've had really explosion in the requirement for sustainability certification, in social audits, environmental audits, etc. And so producers in the Global South have invested very heavily in order to be able to keep accessing those markets. And that implies, obviously, an opportunity cost for the other things that they haven't invested in. And so having gone on that journey and working with all of those companies that we've been, running alongside for the last 20 years, it was really disappointing for us to see again that this issue of fair miles resurged, because we were very involved alongside James and others in 2007. And so we were really very keen to get engaged and get the conversation going again this time around.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting, Simon, that you've referred back to how this isn't necessarily a new concept. In fact, it's been around for quite a while. Why is it significant that it's back now, given that there is so much focus on the reduction of carbon footprinting?
Yeah, well, I think that's it. There is a huge amount, and rightly so. As I said, it is right that we should be striving to achieve net zero, striving to decarbonise our sectors as far as possible. But with that comes this risk that I talked about of unintended consequences. And I think it's, we kind of feel that we need to highlight these risks where they're not being done already. And I think we are among few who are actually talking about the social and economic impacts, even some environmental impacts, especially some environmental impacts of the trade that air freight brings. So it's within it's our responsibility to actually tell the other side of the story that's not often told, to ensure that we're not making the wrong decisions when we're trying to do the right thing.
And what's the biggest thing you'd like to achieve from this, James? And I suppose just as importantly, how do you go about doing it?
The most important thing that I'd like to see coming out of this is for consumers of fresh produce, which has been air freighted into UK, Europe, and elsewhere, to be proud of buying those produce, to see that as part of their net zero strategy for their households, for themselves, for their businesses. I'd like to see the companies that are selling to us, the supermarkets and those other big parts of the supply chain, to equally see air freight as being part of their strategy, not as being something that needs to be cut out of the strategy. When you look at the data, when you look at the numbers, and you saw the numbers there, at least 5 million livelihoods in Africa supported through this trade. And that's huge. And what we'd like to see is that sort of evidence brought to bear and not just a focus on carbon emissions, which is not necessarily questionable, but we need to look at the sort of trade-offs. You know, what is going to stop and what is really going to reduce carbon emissions? Turning off the lights, yeah, driving less. Yeah, we all understand that, but air freight is not part of that. It is a win-win. So I'd like to see that sort of pride and that discussion brought back into how decisions are made.
Yes, because on a simplistic level, there is almost a shaming of people with no sort of depth to the conversation, isn't there, around some of these topics? And Morag, we've even seen some EU retailers refusing to stock air-freighted produce. What do you think about those sort of decisions, and how do we ensure that net zero policies and practices don't end up unintentionally, I suppose, restricting and harming third world producers?
That's a very big question. It has been incredibly disappointing to see some retailers taking the decision to stop supplying air-freighted fresh produce. It makes a very nice marketing line, you know. It's very attractive, it looks, you know, it's catchy. What we really want out of this dialogue now is to really get some discussion going about whether that's, you know, Simon's been saying it's not the right thing to do, but we need more people to be analysing and thinking why it's not the right thing to do. As I was saying before, we've seen many countries, many export sectors making huge strides in accessing global markets. And this decision is really based on quite a knee-jerk reaction. It's not based on sound data. And we need to be looking at other ways to be addressing the problem. I think what was very interesting in the speaker that was on just before us, he mentioned the -15 coalition. You know, that just in itself was demonstrated that it could reduce emissions by twice the amount of Kenya's global emissions annually. I mean, we need to be looking at supply chains and as value chains as where we can have most impact and provide most benefit. But to do that isn't to the detriment of poor and vulnerable producers. Simon, in his opening presentation, you know, he raised the issue of climate justice. What we're talking about here is countries that are supplying perishable products that at the moment we don't necessarily have solutions to be able to transport those to Europe in any other way. You know, the industry is doing a huge amount actually to try and decarbonize, as we've seen from the previous speaker, to try to look for opportunities to actually achieve lower emission levels. But when we're looking at some of these producers in Kenya, in Ghana, etc., at the moment, there are no other solutions. But to be targeting them as a quick win, to show, you know, that we're cutting emissions is actually such a wrong thing to do. These are, in the main, producers that are already suffering most from the impacts of climate change. They've contributed least to creating the problem in the first place. And so that there is this very strong moral argument that actually, you know, that is not where we should be starting. We should be trying to get dialogue going as a value chain, and we should be investing much more in research to identify where really we can have most impact.
Yeah, absolutely. And while we're talking about producers, I'm delighted to say we do have a Kenyan producer here in the audience, Leah. And Leah, could I ask you to just talk to us a little bit about the impact of the air freight sector and how it supports your industry, really?
Good morning. My name's Leah Major Sonkoi. I am from Kenya, and I am a producer. And I think I can say I represent some of the 5 million people that will be impacted by these decisions. So what we do is we support small-scale farmers to be able to meet global standards for export of fresh herbs, vegetables, and fruits. And I can confidently say that we are trying our best to conserve the environment and put practices in place that will help with these global emissions. But there are some areas, like air freight, for example, that are quite critical for our success. So, like, for example, with fresh herbs, we have a very short shelf life. if you are looking at something like 10 days for some products, so sea freight is not an option, and therefore we have to rely on air freight to get to the market. We don't always supply throughout the year. A lot of our demand is during the winter season when there is no options in this part of the world. And, you know, if we were to say that it's better to produce in glass greenhouses in Europe during that time, we are not really helping the situation. So I hope and we believe that hopefully we can have a reasonable approach to this problem as we all work together to get to the net zero. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And just one follow-up question. Are you seeing impacts of climate change already in your production? Are you noticing differences in terms of weather patterns and those sort of effects?
Absolutely. So we are seeing, different seasons coming early. Like, for example, the rainy season either delaying or coming too soon and affecting the harvest. A lot of flooding in some parts of the continent, as well as extensive droughts. So we are seeing all these things, and we are trying to manage as much as possible. And the work that has been done into, that has been put into getting these farms and these farmers to get to the level whereby they can supply retail supermarkets in Europe, it has been a lot. And managing that along with the climate change, and now getting news that maybe we are going to stop altogether, it's really giving us some restless nights, but we hope that a solution, a workable solution, a win-win situation can be found. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. Really appreciate that. Simon, it seems that this is very much a communication piece, isn't it? It's talking to, obviously, retailers and buyers, and it's also talking to consumers, and many consumers, increasing numbers of consumers, want to do the right thing. We think about conscious consumerism, and often maybe they do think about it, as has been raised, purely from a carbon, my own personal carbon footprint perspective, and don't necessarily think about the impact at the other end of the chain. What are the key approaches in terms of getting that communication message out, do you think? How do you approach what is not a simple conversation? Because we often talk about consumers needing simple, easily digestible messages. What are those messages here?
Yeah, well, I mean, the challenge is it's not a simple answer, and how we get that across simply is the difficult thing. But I think by talking to as we did 16 years ago, engaging with the NGOs who've got an interest in this area, talking to the media, getting the story out there in terms of the good news stories, not just looking at the carbon emissions, but some of the things we've talked about here today. All the progress that we're making down the supply chain in terms of sustainable agriculture, what we're doing around biodiversity, reducing our waste, how we're sort of switching to more sustainable materials. I think the danger is if we focus all on carbon, then we aren't encouraged to actually continue those good things that we need to be doing that are within our direct control. So I think it's about telling the story, as I keep saying, engaging with the right stakeholders, talking to the retailers as well, and collaboration and communication is a big part of that. Bringing everybody on board as part of this journey, and ensuring that we're not just seeing the headlines about the negative, the negative implications or the negative carbon emissions, that we're actually looking at it based on more data. We need to do more research, and telling the story about the social, the human stories as well. So that's what we're looking to do. More research, more collaboration, more advocacy to hopefully inform policymakers and decision makers.
Okay, thank you. We've only got about 5 minutes left. I would like to give you the opportunity to put any questions you may have to our panelists. Does anybody have something they would like to ask? Just while you're having a think about that, James, in terms of, obviously, this is a business event, how do we better support businesses involved in the fresh produce sector to take a fair approach, as it were, to net zero?
Yeah, every business has a different perspective on this. We are talking about trade-offs. We're talking about investments that are made in reducing carbon emissions and various other elements of the sustainability spectrum. We are very aware that every business has different needs, and we're very keen to sort of understand those and build those into the Fair Miles branding, but also into the messaging, because this is about communication. This is about making sure that everybody can work together. So as Simon said, we're going to be at the booth a bit later, so if you have any specific questions, very happy to field those then. But ultimately, we know that this is about making more money and having a sustainable business. You know, the fresh produce supply chains of the world shouldn't be held hostage by some British politicians who come up with a nice bit of branding, and frankly, some very simple branding around things like food miles, which we know doesn't help many of our businesses, but really works with consumers. So that's where we need to be, focusing our efforts.
And a question down here at the front.
Günther Tauer from the company TBS. What about the CO2 vouchers? Have you already included in your, let's say, fair approach to net zero? For example, companies like Shopify as well as Microsoft, they will be in, well, CO2 zero on 2030. And they are actually buying biochar worldwide. So it could be a possibility for a short term before we get hydrogen air flight.
Thank you for that. Who'd like to comment on that?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for that question. I think absolutely it's something that we should be looking at as part of our wider business strategies in terms of how we reduce our emissions, looking at offsetting and insetting, more specifically where it's allowed within SBTi or the guidelines that we have to work towards to reduce emissions. I think you're looking at some of the things that the airlines are doing, such as sustainable aviation fuels, can provide solutions as well. So there's all kinds of mechanisms that we can look at to reduce our emissions. But I guess what we're saying here today is that give us time. Yes, we do need to decarbonise as quickly as possible. But with Fair Miles, what we're saying, as I keep repeating, is that it's not just about the carbon. It is about the carbon, but it's also about the human story as well, and the implications of the actions that we take in our journeys to net zero. So in answer to your question, I think there are lots of things that we can think about. But we're keen to obviously explore the full sustainability picture when we look at Fair Miles.
Thank you very much. Any other last questions? No, in that case, we will draw to a close there, but please do join our panelists and have a chat with them later on, or go over to the co-lead stand to hear more about it. So please just do give a round of applause to our panelists for their excellent contributions. Thank you.